Spring 1945. Bavaria lay shattered beneath a pale sky, and in the chaos of Germany's collapse, 3 young women in tattered Wehrmacht auxiliary uniforms found themselves prisoners of an army they had been taught to fear. What they discovered in captivity would challenge everything the Third Reich had burned into their minds. The trucks rattled through villages reduced to rubble, past columns of refugees trudging nowhere with everything they owned strapped to their backs. Inside the canvas-covered vehicle, the women sat in silence, hands bound loosely, guarded by American soldiers whose language they barely understood. They were Nachrichtenfeldfun, signal corps, auxiliaries, who had operated radio equipment for the German military. When the front collapsed, they had fled on foot through the Bavarian forests, surviving 3 days on stolen potatoes before being apprehended by an American patrol near the ruins of a bombed-out farmhouse. The oldest among them was 24, a former university student from Heidelberg who had postponed her literature degree to serve the fatherland. The youngest had just turned 19, daughter of a small-town shopkeeper who had closed his doors when Jewish neighbors disappeared in the night. The third came from an industrial family in the Ruhr Valley, raised on propaganda speeches and torchlight parades. All 3 had believed, with varying degrees of conviction, that Germany fought for civilization itself against barbaric hordes. All 3 were about to learn how thoroughly they had been deceived. The processing camp materialized through the early morning fog like something from a fevered dream. Hastily constructed barracks surrounded by barbed wire, guard towers at each corner, the stars and stripes hanging limp in the damp air. American military police directed the trucks through heavy gates that clanged shut with mechanical finality. The women climbed down onto muddy ground, legs stiff from hours of travel, stomachs hollow with hunger and dread. Nazi propaganda had filled their heads with lurid tales of what happened to German women captured by the Allies. Mass executions, torture chambers, violations too horrible to speak aloud. They braced themselves for the worst. But the first shock came from an unexpected direction. The soldiers forming them into orderly lines, checking names against clipboards, directing them toward the barracks designated for female prisoners, were not the blonde Nordic types they had seen on American propaganda posters. Those men were black, African-American soldiers in United States Army uniforms, moving with crisp military efficiency, speaking English among themselves in accents that ranged from southern drawls to northern city rhythms. For women raised in a nation that had systematically purged any mention of racial diversity from its public consciousness. For young people who had literally never seen a black person except in Nazi propaganda films designed to dehumanize, the reality struck like cold water to the face. And then there was the smell, the aroma, something unfamiliar that hung in the air around these soldiers, a scent that the women could not immediately identify. It was not unpleasant exactly, but utterly foreign to their experience. A combination of fragrances that spoke of an entirely different world, different products, different cultural practices. Hair pomade with a distinct petroleum-sweet smell, tobacco that carried spicier notes than the harsh German cigarettes they knew. Cooking odors drifting from the mess hall that included spices and seasonings never found in wartime German rations. The cumulative effect was disorienting, adding another layer of strangeness to an already surreal situation. The Heidelberg student found herself fixating on this detail as they were processed through intake procedures. A sergeant with corporal stripes on his sleeve checked her papers, his dark hands competent and assured as he wrote information onto official forms. He wore his uniform with precision, every button fastened, every crease sharp. When he looked up to ask her a question in careful textbook German, she caught the scent again, stronger this time. It emanated from his hair, from the pomade he had used that morning to maintain his appearance within military regulations. Murray's superior hairdressing pomade, though she had no way of knowing the brand name. A product as common in black American communities as bread and butter, sold in every drugstore and barbershop from Harlem to Chicago's South Side. It might as well have been perfume from Mars. The processing continued with bureaucratic thoroughness, names recorded, possessions inventoried, though they had almost nothing left, photographs taken for identification, medical examination by an army doctor who checked for injuries, malnutrition, communicable diseases. The women waited for brutality that never came. Instead, they encountered the Geneva Convention implemented with American efficiency. Prisoners of war had rights under international law, and the United States military adhered to those protocols even as rumors began to filter through about what Allied forces were discovering in German concentration camps. The contrast between what these women expected and what they received created a cognitive dissonance that left them confused and frightened in new ways. They were assigned to Barracks 7, a long wooden structure with rows of bunk beds, a pot-bellied stove at each end, windows that actually had glass, clean blankets, straw mattresses that were thin but serviceable, a bathroom facility with actual plumbing. After years of German wartime austerity, after weeks of chaos as the front collapsed, these basic amenities felt almost luxurious. Other women were already there, prisoners taken in previous sweeps through the collapsing Third Reich. Some had been there for weeks. They answered questions in whispered conversations, sharing information about how this strange new world operated. The guards were all from the same unit, a tank battalion that had fought its way across France and into Germany. The 761st Tank Battalion, nicknamed the Black Panthers, one of the few African-American armored units allowed to see combat. They had proven themselves under fire at the Battle of the Bulge, had liberated towns in France, had pushed through the Siegfried Line when Wehrmacht resistance was still formidable. Now, with Germany defeated and the shooting war winding down, they had been assigned to occupation duties, guarding prisoners of war, maintaining order in a conquered nation, waiting to go home to an America that still maintained rigid segregation, where their heroism would be acknowledged in their own communities but ignored or minimized by the larger white society. The daily routine established itself with military precision. Wake at 6 to the sound of a bell. Roll call in the yard, counted and recounted. Breakfast in the mess hall, where they received portions that seemed generous by the standards of wartime Germany. Oatmeal, powdered eggs, bread, occasionally meat. Coffee that was real coffee, not the ersatz chicory blend they had choked down for years. Then work assignments, because the Geneva Convention mandated that prisoners be given productive labor. The women were assigned to kitchen duty, laundry, administrative tasks that required German language skills. Light work, compared to what many German posts faced in Soviet camps, where survival itself was uncertain. It was during these work details that proximity began to erode propaganda. The kitchen brought the Heidelberg student into daily contact with the soldiers who worked there, particularly the cooks who prepared meals for both guards and prisoners. One of them, a young man from New Orleans named Thompson, took particular care with his cooking, despite the limitations of army rations. He had worked in his family's restaurant before the war, and he brought that expertise to bear even on military food. He used spices and seasonings that the German women had never encountered: cayenne pepper, file powder, bay leaves, hot sauce made from peppers grown somewhere impossibly far away. These were the sources of some of those unfamiliar aromas that had struck them so forcefully upon arrival. Thompson spoke almost no German, and the women spoke almost no English, but food became a universal language. He showed them how to season beans to make them palatable, how to transform bland army potatoes into something approaching actual cuisine. He moved through the kitchen with confidence and skill, his hands quick and knowing. The Heidelberg student watched and learned and felt her carefully constructed worldview beginning to crack. The Nazi Party had taught that black people were barely above animals, incapable of civilization, inferior in every measurable way. Yet here was a man who demonstrated artistry and intelligence in his craft, who treated her with casual courtesy, who made jokes she could not understand, but whose humor was evident in his ready smile. The youngest of the three women, the shopkeeper's daughter, was assigned to laundry duty. She worked alongside two other prisoners under the supervision of a corporal from Alabama, a man named Williams who had been a schoolteacher before the war. He had taught mathematics and basic sciences to black children in a one-room schoolhouse that received a fraction of the funding given to white schools. When the war came, he had enlisted despite knowing that the military would segregate, would limit his opportunities, would treat him as second class even as it demanded he risk his life. He had done it anyway, because he believed in defeating fascism, because he hoped that service might earn his people greater recognition, because sometimes you fight even when the odds are stacked against you. Williams had taught himself German by studying a dictionary and grammar books during the long Atlantic crossing and the months of combat that followed. He spoke it haltingly, but with impressive dedication to proper grammar. When he gave instructions to the laundry detail, he did so in their own language, carefully pronounced. The youngest prisoner found herself simultaneously grateful and unsettled. This was supposed to be one of the inferior races. That was what every teacher, every Hitler youth leader, every propaganda broadcast had insisted. Subhuman, incapable of higher thought, dangerous. Yet Williams carried himself with quiet dignity, corrected her mistakes with patience, and sometimes stood by the laundry room door during breaks reading from a battered paperback book. Once, curiosity overcame her conditioning, and she edged close enough to see the title, Goethe, Faust, in the original German. A black American soldier from the segregated South, reading classical German literature for pleasure while guarding prisoners from the nation that had considered itself the master race. The third woman, from the industrial Ruhr Valley, worked in the camp administrative office. Her job involved filing paperwork, translating documents, maintaining records that tracked prisoner movements and supply inventories. This brought her into regular contact with the sergeant who managed the office, a man named Patterson from Chicago. Before the war, Patterson had worked as a clerk in a meatpacking plant, one of the better jobs available to black men in the industrial North. He had joined the Army hoping for advancement opportunities that civilian life denied him. He had learned to navigate institutional racism with a combination of competence and quiet determination. He did his job so well that white officers could not justify denying him promotion, though they found ways to limit how far he could rise. Patterson kept his workspace organized with meticulous care, files in perfect order, forms completed without errors. His handwriting was clear and precise. He treated the German women working under him with professional courtesy, neither friendly nor hostile, simply correct. But gradually, over days and weeks, small conversations began. Questions about forms led to broader discussions. He asked about German administrative procedures out of genuine curiosity about how another military system functioned. She answered carefully at first, then with increasing openness. He shared observations about American bureaucracy, about the ways military paperwork could proliferate into absurdity. These were not deep philosophical exchanges, but they were human interactions that slowly normalized each other's existence. And always there was that aroma, the pomade that nearly every black soldier used. Because maintaining proper grooming standards in the military required products designed for their hair type, Murray's, Royal Crown, Dixie Peach. Names that meant nothing to the German women, but represented entire industries that had grown up to serve the needs of black American consumers. The tobacco some soldiers smoked, often different brands than white soldiers preferred, or hand-rolled cigarettes made with paper and tobacco purchased from post exchanges. The cooking smells from the segregated mess facilities, because even in the Army, black and white soldiers often ate separately, and the black cooks naturally prepared food in the traditions they knew. All of these combined into an olfactory signature that marked different, that reminded the German women they were in the presence of an alien culture. But familiarity, as it always does, bred not contempt, but normalization. After 2 weeks, the Heidelberg student barely noticed the pomade smell anymore. It had simply become part of the background, no more remarkable than the scent of the wood stove or the laundry soap. What she did notice was the way Sergeant Thompson hummed while he worked in the kitchen, melodies that were completely foreign to her musical education. She later learned these were spirituals, religious songs that had emerged from slavery, had been passed down through generations, had evolved into a uniquely American art form. Nobody knows the trouble I've seen. Swing low, sweet chariot. Songs of suffering and endurance and hope. One evening, after the day's work was complete and the prisoners had been returned to their barracks, someone produced a harmonica. Music drifted across the compound from the guards' quarters. Jazz, that distinctively American sound that the Nazis had banned as degenerate. The women sat by the windows listening, unable to help themselves. The music was complex, sophisticated, full of improvisation and emotional depth. It spoke of sadness and joy intermixed, of resilience in the face of hardship, of finding beauty in a world that often offered ugliness. The youngest woman found tears running down her face without quite understanding why. Perhaps because the music was beautiful. Perhaps because it represented everything her education had taught her to despise, and yet it moved her in ways that Wagner never had. The turning point came in the 3rd week, during a moment that seemed insignificant at the time. The Heidelberg student was working in the kitchen, peeling potatoes for the evening meal, when Sergeant Thompson received a letter from home. She watched his face as he read it, saw his expression move through joy and concern, and something darker. When he looked up and caught her watching, he did not look away. Instead, he said something in English, his tone making it clear he was not addressing her so much as speaking his thoughts aloud. She understood nothing except the emotional content, the weight of whatever news the letter contained. On impulse, she responded in German, her voice gentle. Ich hoffe, es sind gute Nachrichten. I hope it is good news. He looked at her for a long moment, then smiled sadly and shook his head. He held up the letter and said one word she did understand, because it was the same in both languages. Mama. Then he made a gesture that she interpreted as illness or trouble. His mother was sick, or struggling, or facing some difficulty he could not address from thousands of miles away in occupied Germany. Without thinking, she made a small gesture of sympathy, the universal language of shared human concern. And something shifted between them in that moment, some barrier dissolving. He was not a symbol or a category or a piece of Nazi propaganda. He was a man far from home, worried about his mother, doing a job in circumstances he had not chosen. She was not a prisoner, or a representative of the enemy, or a reformed Nazi. She was another human being who recognized pain when she saw it. The recognition was mutual and profound. From that day forward, their interactions in the kitchen carried a different quality. Thompson began teaching her English words for the foods they prepared. Potato, onion, salt, pepper. She taught him German. Equivalents: Kartoffel, Zwiebel, Salz, Pfeffer. These simple vocabulary lessons expanded into broader attempts at communication, supplemented by gestures and drawings, and eventually a battered English-German dictionary that Patterson provided from the camp library. Language barriers remained formidable, but intent became clearer. Thompson shared photographs of his family in New Orleans, pointed out his mother in a group portrait taken in front of a modest wooden house. She studied the faces of people whose world was utterly foreign to her own, but whose humanity was undeniable. The youngest woman experienced her revelation through music. The camp occasionally hosted entertainment evenings, when soldiers who were musically inclined performed for their fellows. The battalion had several talented musicians, men who had played in church bands or school orchestras or jazz clubs before the war. One Saturday evening, they gave an informal concert that prisoners were permitted to attend under guard. The women sat on benches in the mess hall, while 5 soldiers with trumpet, clarinet, drums, piano, and bass created music that seemed to come from another dimension. They played jazz standards, swing numbers, blues that ached with melancholy. They played with skill that demonstrated years of practice and natural talent. The youngest prisoner sat transfixed, having never heard anything like it. This was music the Nazi regime had banned, had condemned as the product of inferior races, had literally made illegal to perform or listen to. Yet it was more sophisticated, more emotionally complex, more genuinely moving than most of what she had been force-fed through state-controlled radio. When the trumpeter began playing a slow spiritual, transforming the melody into something that spoke of centuries of pain and unbroken dignity, she felt something break inside her chest. These were not subhumans. These were not savages. These were artists whose culture had been systematically degraded and dismissed by an ideology built on lies. The woman from the Ruhr Valley found her transformation through words rather than music or food. Patterson, noticing her obvious education and careful German, brought her books from the camp library during slow periods in the office. At first, he selected simple volumes in German, basic texts that would not challenge military regulations about what prisoners could access. But gradually, he brought more sophisticated material, German classics that had somehow ended up in the Army's collection: Schiller, Heine, Lessing. She devoured them hungrily, having been starved for real literature during years of Nazi-approved cultural poverty. One afternoon, Patterson set down a volume on her desk with particular care. She looked at the title, The Sorrows of Young Werther by Goethe. She glanced up at him questioning. He said, in his careful German, Ich habe das in der Schule gelesen. I read this in school. She stared. He had read Goethe in school. This black sergeant from Chicago's South Side had received an education that included classical German literature. Her surprise must have shown on her face because he smiled without humor in it. Wir sind nicht alle unwissend. We are not all ignorant. The gentle rebuke struck home. She had assumed, based on nothing but propaganda and prejudice, that these men were uneducated, that they were intellectually inferior, that their presence in American uniforms represented some kind of desperation measure by a military scraping the bottom of the barrel. Every assumption was proving false. Patterson was easily her intellectual equal, possibly her superior in education. Williams, the corporal, had been a teacher. Thompson, the cook, was an artist in his own right. The trumpeter from the concert had mentioned studying music theory at some institution she had never heard of, one of the historically black colleges that existed in America's segregated South, institutions that provided higher education to students barred from white universities. The cognitive dissonance became unbearable. These women had been raised in a system that made racial hierarchy foundational to its worldview. Aryans at the top. Everyone else arranged in descending order of supposed worth. Black people at the bottom, barely human. Every school lesson, every propaganda film, every Hitler Youth media enforced this message. It was not just political ideology, but supposedly scientific fact, proven by experts in white lab coats who measured skulls and cited Darwin mangled beyond recognition. The entire edifice of Nazi thought rested on the assumption of racial inequality. But lived experience was demolishing that edifice brick by brick. These American soldiers were demonstrably not inferior. They were competent, educated, talented, kind, cruel, funny, serious. Unique individuals with the full range of human characteristics. Some were better educated than the guards from white units who occasionally rotated through the camp. Some were more skilled at their jobs. Some displayed moral courage and dignity that put their captors to shame. Captors who had participated in a war of aggression launched by a genocidal regime. The Heidelberg student finally articulated this crisis during a whispered late-night conversation in the barracks. "Everything we were taught was a lie," she said to the darkness, knowing the others were awake and listening. Not just exaggerations or mistakes, complete fabrications. If they lied about this, what else was? The silence that followed was heavy with implications. If racial ideology was fiction, what about the reasons for the war? What about the treatment of Jews, Roma, disabled people, everyone the regime had classified as undesirable? What about the camps whose existence was beginning to emerge in rumors that made the blood run cold? The youngest woman responded first, her voice barely audible. "My father told me once, before I left for service, that our neighbor Herr Goldstein had been a good man. He said it like a confession, like he was admitting a sin. I did not understand then why he was ashamed. I think I'm beginning to understand now. The shame of having participated, even passively, in a system built on lies. The shame of not questioning, not resisting, not seeing what should have been obvious." The woman from the Ruhr Valley added, "We cannot undo what was done. We cannot give back what was taken. But perhaps we can refuse to continue spreading the poison. Perhaps that is all that is left to us now." It was not absolution. It was not redemption. It was simply recognition that they had been complicit in evil through their acceptance of propaganda, and that moving forward required rejecting what they had been taught. In the fourth week, the Heidelberg student made a decision that felt both momentous and simple. She approached Sergeant Thompson during a break in kitchen work and asked him, in halting English supplemented by gestures, about the pomade. What was it? Why did he use it? She pointed to her own hair, then to his, trying to communicate her question. Thompson understood. He pulled a small tin from his pocket and showed her the label. "Murray's Superior Hairdressing Pomade," he explained, mostly through gestures since his German was non-existent and her English remained basic, that it was simply a grooming product. He demonstrated how he used it to maintain his hair within military regulations. There was nothing exotic or mysterious about it. It was simply a product designed for a specific purpose, sold commercially, used by millions of people she had never encountered because her nation had been racially homogeneous and her ideology had insisted that homogeneity was virtue. The strange aroma that had struck her so forcefully upon arrival was nothing more than unfamiliarity masquerading as difference, masquerading as inferiority. She had judged based on a superficial sensory experience, had allowed that judgment to confirm prejudices literally beaten into her by years of indoctrination. The recognition of her own foolishness was humbling and painful and necessary. Thompson, sensing that something significant was happening, even if he did not fully understand it, made a generous gesture. He opened the tin and offered to let her smell it directly, up close, without the overlay of fear and prejudice. She hesitated, then leaned forward and inhaled. The scent was sweet, slightly medicinal, utterly ordinary. Just a grooming product. Just a choice made by millions of people about how to care for their appearance. Nothing threatening, nothing inferior, nothing that justified the edifice of hatred that had been constructed upon such trivial differences. She stepped back and said, in careful English, "Thank you." Thompson nodded, understanding that something more than information had been exchanged. The youngest prisoner, working nearby, had watched the entire interaction. She met the Heidelberg student's eyes, and something passed between them, a shared recognition, a mutual acknowledgement that they had been fools, and that wisdom was beginning to dawn too late to prevent the catastrophe their nation had become. The end of the war in Europe came officially on May 8, 1945. News filtered through the camp of Germany's unconditional surrender. Hitler was dead, reportedly by his own hand, in a Berlin bunker. The Third Reich, that was supposed to last 1,000 years, had collapsed in 12. The prisoners received the news with mixed emotions. Relief that the killing had stopped. Fear about what would happen to them and to Germany. Grief for the destroyed nation they would have to return to. Shame at what their country had done, crimes whose full scope was only beginning to emerge as Allied forces liberated concentration camps, and documented horrors that defied comprehension. The black soldiers of the 761st Tank Battalion received their own news around the same time. They would be shipping out within weeks, rotating back to the United States. Their guard duties would be assumed by different units. For the prisoners who had spent weeks under their supervision, this created an unexpected sadness. These men who had been strangers and enemies had become familiar, had treated them with decency, had inadvertently provided lessons about humanity that would last a lifetime. On one of the final days before the battalion departed, Sergeant Thompson sought out the Heidelberg student during kitchen duty. He carried something in his hand, a small object wrapped in paper. Through gestures and broken language, he indicated it was a gift. She unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a tin of Murray's pomade, nearly full, identical to the one he had shown her weeks earlier. He said something in English that she did not fully understand, but the intent was clear. He wanted her to have it. A memento, a reminder, a symbol of lessons learned. She tried to refuse, knowing that such products were not easily obtained, that he would need it himself when he returned home. But he insisted, pressing it into her hands with a smile that was kind and sad simultaneously. Finally she accepted, clutching the small tin like something precious. "Danke," she said, then tried the English. "Thank you." He nodded, satisfied, and returned to his work. They did not speak again before his unit departed 3 days later. The women lined up with other prisoners as the battalion prepared to leave, trucks loaded with equipment and personnel. They watched the black soldiers who had guarded them board vehicles and prepare for the long journey home. Some prisoners waved tentatively. A few soldiers waved back. Thompson caught the Heidelberg student's eye from across the compound and touched his hand to his cap in a small salute. She returned it awkwardly, feeling tears she refused to shed. These men were going home to an America that still practiced segregation, that still denied them basic civil rights, that still treated them as second-class citizens, despite their service and sacrifice. The irony was bitter and inescapable. The new guards who replaced the 761st were white Americans from a different unit. They were not cruel, but they lacked the particular dynamic that had developed between the black soldiers and German prisoners. There was no bridge of shared outsider status, no recognition of parallel struggles against systems that dehumanized. The women missed the men who had guarded them, which would have been unthinkable a month earlier. Processing for release began in June as the occupation settled into routine. The women would be sent back to their homes, or what remained of them, with papers that documented their status as cleared prisoners of war. They would return to a Germany that was rubble and ruin, occupied by 4 Allied powers divided into zones, beginning the long process of confronting what it had done and what had been done to it. They would carry their experiences with them, stories that many Germans would not want to hear, truths that contradicted comfortable myths about the war. The Heidelberg student returned to find her city partly destroyed, her university building damaged by bombs, her former professors mostly fled or discredited. The world of learning she had left behind no longer existed. She would eventually find work as a translator for American occupation authorities, a position that brought her into contact with soldiers of all backgrounds. She kept the tin of Murray's pomade for the rest of her life, never using it, simply preserving it as a tangible reminder of the lessons learned in captivity. The youngest woman went home to find her father's shop destroyed and her family scattered. Her father had died in the final chaotic months of fighting. Her mother had survived and wept when her daughter appeared at the door. They rebuilt slowly, scavenging bricks from ruins, trading possessions for food, learning to live in the new Germany that emerged from ashes. She told her mother about the black soldiers who had guarded her, about their kindness and competence and humanity. Her mother listened in silence, then said simply, Herr Goldstein tried to tell us. We did not listen. The woman from the Ruhr Valley returned to find her industrial city hammered flat by Allied bombing. Her family's factory was gone, reduced to twisted metal and broken machinery. She would eventually emigrate to America in the 1950s, sponsored by a relief organization helping German refugees. She settled in New York City and took a job as a secretary. One day, riding the subway to work, she sat across from a black man in a business suit reading a German newspaper. He looked up, caught her staring, and smiled politely. She wanted to tell him about Patterson and Thompson and Williams, about the men who had shown her that everything she had been taught was a lie, but she did not have the words, and the moment passed. She rode the rest of the way in silence, thinking about pomade and jazz and the high cost of ignorance. The historical record is clear about the broad strokes of this period. African-American soldiers served throughout the European theater in segregated units. They guarded prisoners of war in occupied Germany. They interacted daily with German civilians and military prisoners, often becoming the first black people those Germans had ever encountered. The cognitive dissonance this created was real and documented. German posts frequently wrote home about their surprise at the treatment they received, the competence and education of their guards, the disconnect between Nazi propaganda and lived reality. The 761st Tank Battalion was real, and its service record was distinguished. The battalion fought in 6 countries, participated in major engagements including the Battle of the Bulge, and received numerous commendations for valor. After combat operations ended, elements of the battalion participated in occupation duties, including guarding prisoners and maintaining order in conquered territory. The men of the 761st returned home to an America that had not fundamentally changed its racial attitudes during their absence. Segregation remained law in the South and practice in much of the North. The Double V campaign, which urged victory over fascism abroad and racism at home, achieved only partial success. The paradox of German prisoners being treated better in America than black American soldiers was real and extensively documented. White German posts could indeed access facilities marked whites, only that black soldiers in uniform could not enter. This created situations of bitter irony that were not lost on the participant. Some German prisoners expressed surprise and confusion about American segregation, finding it paradoxical that a nation fighting against Nazi racial ideology maintained its own system of racial hierarchy. Some African American soldiers developed a sense of solidarity with German prisoners based on their mutual experience of being dehumanized by systems neither had created. The cultural products were Murray's Superior hairdressing pomade was indeed a common product in black American communities, sold widely and used by millions. Royal Crown and Dixie Peach were equally common brands. These products were necessary for maintaining military grooming standards and were entirely ordinary within their cultural context. To Germans encountering them for the first time, they would have been completely unfamiliar, contributing to the sense of foreignness that accompanied first contact with African Americans. The music was real. Negro spirituals, jazz, blues, and swing were all genuine African American art forms that had developed over generations. Military bands attached to segregated black units were often highly accomplished, featuring musicians who were professionals or serious students of their craft. These bands performed for troops and occasionally for prisoners, introducing European audiences to musical traditions they had been told were primitive or degenerate. The response was often surprise at the sophistication and emotional depth of the music. The broader historical context matters enormously. These interactions occurred in the immediate aftermath of the Holocaust, as the full scope of Nazi genocide was being revealed to a horrified world. German prisoners who might have maintained their prejudices in the abstract found them increasingly difficult to sustain in the face of both evidence of their nation's crimes and the lived reality of their captors' humanity. The combination was psychologically overwhelming for many. Some refused to confront it, maintaining Nazi beliefs despite everything. Others, like the women in this narrative, began the painful process of recognizing how thoroughly they had been deceived. The story told here is fictional in its specifics, but historically grounded in documented realities. Women like these existed, though their names and precise experiences are invented for narrative purposes. Soldiers like Thompson, Patterson, and Williams existed in thousands, men who served their country despite knowing that country did not fully recognize their citizenship, who fought fascism abroad while facing racism at home, who maintained their dignity and humanity under circumstances designed to strip both away. The interactions described, while fictionalized in detail, represent patterns that occurred throughout the occupation period. The tin of pomade serves as a physical symbol for a larger truth. What we perceive as fundamental differences are often nothing more than unfamiliar, surface variations that carry no moral weight, but onto which we project entire hierarchies of value. The aroma that seemed so strange, so other, so marked with difference, was simply a grooming product used by people whose history and culture diverged from that of their captives. Nothing about it justified the edifice of racial hatred that Nazi ideology had constructed. Nothing about any of the superficial differences between human populations justifies systems of oppression and violence. The women in this narrative learned that lesson through proximity, through daily interaction, through the slow erosion of propaganda by the reality of human contact. They learned it too late to prevent their participation in one of history's greatest evils. But perhaps others, reading their story or stories like it, might learn it earlier, might recognize that difference is not inferiority, might understand that the unfamiliar is not the enemy, might grasp that humanity is universal, not bounded by race or nation or ideology. The aroma of freedom, in the end, smells like dignity. It carries the scent of justice and equality and the recognition of common humanity. It transcends the artificial boundaries that divide us, the invented hierarchies that elevate some and degrade others. It requires only that we breathe deeply and honestly, that we let go of comfortable prejudices, that we recognize in every face the same essential humanness that looks back from our mirrors. The women in this narrative began that journey in a prisoner of war camp in Bavaria in the spring of 1945. We are still on that journey today, still learning the same lessons, still confronting the same prejudices in different forms. The story continues because the struggle continues, and that small tin of pomade, preserved across the decades, remains a reminder of how much can change when we allow ourselves to truly see one another. If this story opened your eyes to a forgotten chapter of history, help us share it with others. Hit that subscribe button to join our community exploring untold stories from the past. Drop a like if you believe these lessons still matter today, and leave a comment below sharing your thoughts. What surprised you most about this story? Have you heard similar accounts from your own family history? Your engagement helps these important narratives reach more people who need to hear them. Together, we can ensure that the lessons learned in places like that Bavarian camp in 1945 are never forgotten. Subscribe, like, and comment now. Let's keep this conversation going.